Blood roaring in her ears drowned out the sound of $1 billion vanishing. Rachel stood on the rain-slicked pavement, a cheap cardboard box cutting into her manicured palms. The scent of wet asphalt mixed with the lingering lavender of her suddenly obsolete executive washroom. Yesterday she owned the skyline. Today her keycard flashed red, and her bank accounts read 0. This is the anatomy of a free fall. What happens when the platinum parachute snaps, and the only thing waiting at the bottom is a man holding a mop? Silence in a boardroom doesn't sound like peace. It sounds like a vacuum. It sounds like 42 floors of filtered, temperature-controlled air being sucked out of your lungs. Rachel stared at the grain of the mahogany table. It was imported from Brazil. She knew that because she had approved the invoice herself 3 years ago, back when the company was just a hungry startup, and dropping 50 grand on a table felt like planting a flag on the moon. Now she traced the dark swirls in the wood with a numb index finger. Simon, her CFO, cleared his throat. It was a wet, sticky sound. The SEC freeze is comprehensive, Rachel. The offshore discrepancies, they have your digital signature. I didn't sign them, she said. Her voice sounded thin, unconvincing. Not because it was a lie, but because truth no longer carried any currency in this room. She looked up. 8 board members. 8 faces she had enriched, bullied, charmed, and carried to the top of the Forbes list. Not a single pair of eyes would meet hers. Simon was aggressively studying the cap of his fountain pen. Helen was picking at a non-existent flaw in her manicure. They smelled of expensive dry cleaning and sharp adrenaline-laced sweat, the scent of panic. Not for her, for their portfolios. The board has voted unanimously. Simon continued, the words tumbling out too fast, eager to be done with the execution. Effective immediately. Security will escort you to your office to collect personal effects. There was no screaming, no dramatic table flip. Real ruin is horribly polite. Rachel stood. Her knees felt like they belonged to someone else. The leather of her chair squeaked a pathetic, high-pitched whimper that echoed off the floor-to-ceiling glass. She walked to the door. Her stilettos, custom-made in Milan, sank into the plush carpet, suddenly feeling like lead weights. She wanted to turn around and spit venom to remind them who built the empire they were currently pillaging. But her tongue felt thick and dry, coated in ash. The walk to her corner office took 72 seconds. She counted them. The open-plan bullpen, usually a hive of ringing phones and shouted trades, was dead silent as she passed. 200 employees, staring at their monitors, typing nothing. The smell of stale coffee and ozone from the servers hung heavy in the air. Security was waiting. Frank, he had a small shaving cut on his jaw. Rachel used to ask him about his daughter's braces. Now his face was a mask of rigid, uncomfortable authority. He handed her a collapsed banker's box. It was coarse, the edges sharp. Just personal items, Ms. Hayes. No electronics, no files. She packed mechanically. A framed photograph of her late father. A heavy crystal paperweight. A half-empty bottle of generic aspirin. Her hands shook, rattling the pills against the plastic. That was the only outward sign of the tectonic plates shifting beneath her life. She left the building through the loading dock, not the revolving glass doors at the front. The freight elevator smelled of industrial floor wax and wet dog. When the heavy metal doors slid open to the alley, the damp December chill hit her face like a wet towel. It was raining. A cold, miserable drizzle that immediately began to soak into the shoulders of her tailored wool coat. It smelled faintly of wet sheep and exhaust fumes. She walked out from under the concrete overhang and stopped. Where do you go when you're home? Your car and your private accounts are collateral in a federal fraud investigation. Her phone, a company asset, had been confiscated. Her platinum credit cards would already be declining. She had $84 in cash in her purse. She began to walk. The city, her city, the one she used to survey from a penthouse balcony with a glass of scotch in hand, suddenly felt massive and hostile. The pavement was slick with oily rainbows. Pedestrians bumped her shoulders, muttering curses, not caring about the cut of her clothes or the invisible crown she used to wear. She was just another obstacle on the sidewalk. A horn blared inches from her hip as she blindly crossed an intersection. The blast rattled her teeth. The shock shattered the fragile glass wall of her numbness. Her chest tightened. The air grew thin. Panic, sharp and jagged, clawed at her throat. She ducked into the recessed doorway of a closed electronics store, pressing her back against the cold security grill. She slid down the rough metal, catching on her silk blouse, until she hit the wet concrete. The box rested on her knees. The rain dripped from the rusted awning above, hitting the cardboard with a hollow thwack, thwack, thwack. Her $3,000 coat was ruined. Her empire was gone. Her name was toxic. She buried her face in her hands, inhaling the scent of city grime and her own cold sweat, and waited for the world to stop spinning. It didn't. Night fell like a bruised eyelid. The drizzle had evolved into a steady, freezing downpour, washing the city in harsh neon reflections. Rachel had been walking for hours, driven by a primal need to keep moving, terrified that if she stopped, the sheer weight of the day would crush her spine. Her feet were bleeding. The designer heels had blistered her heels an hour ago. Now the skin was raw and weeping, sticking to the damp leather. She smelled like wet wool exhaust and the coppery tang of her own fear. She found herself descending the concrete stairs into a subterranean transit hub. The air down here was thick and stagnant, smelling sharply of stale urine ozone and cheap bleach. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the cracked tile floor. It was past midnight. The commuter rush was a distant memory, leaving behind the city's nocturnal ghosts. Rachel limped toward a row of molded plastic chairs bolted to the wall. She dropped the heavy cardboard box. It hit the floor with a wet thud, the damp bottom giving way. The crystal paperweight rolled out, clinking against the tiles. The framed photo of her father landed face down. She didn't pick them up. She simply collapsed onto the rigid plastic, her wet coat pooling around her like a dirty shroud. She wrapped her arms around her ribs, shivering violently. Her jaw ached from clenching it. "Legs up, please." The voice was low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of pity. Rachel blinked, pulling her head up. A man stood a few feet away. He wore faded blue coveralls that had been washed so many times the fabric looked soft, almost grey. He was pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket with a wheel that shrieked like a dying bird. He wasn't looking at her face. His eyes were focused on the muddy tracks her ruined shoes had left on his freshly swept floor. He smelled of industrial pine cleaner and old coffee. "Excuse me," Rachel croaked. Her throat felt full of sand. "I need to mop under the bench," he said, gesturing with the wooden handle of the mop. "Legs up." Any other day, Rachel would have fired a man for looking at her with such profound indifference. She would have made a phone call and erased him. Now she just numbly pulled her knees to her chest, her wet shoes lifting off the tile. He swung the mop in broad, efficient arcs. The wet slap of the strings against the floor was rhythmic, grounding. He didn't ask what a woman in a soaked designer coat was doing in a bus terminal at 1 a.m. He didn't ask why she looked like she'd been hit by a truck. He just did his job. As he maneuvered the bucket, Rachel noticed a small mound on the bench opposite hers. A faded winter coat was draped over it. The mound shifted, and a small sneaker poked out from beneath the hem. A child. The man caught her looking. He paused, leaning his weight on the mop handle. He looked tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion was etched into the lines around his eyes and the tight set of his shoulders. Childcare fell through, he said, his voice defensive but flat. He sleeps through the noise, mostly. Rachel looked from the sleeping boy back to the man. I lost my company today, she said. The words slipped out before she could stop them. They sounded absurd in this cavernous, echoing tunnel, disconnected from reality. The janitor Thomas looked at her, really looked at her this time. He saw the ruined silk, the bleeding heels, the cardboard box, vomiting its contents onto the wet floor. He didn't gasp. He didn't offer a platitude about things getting better. My wife took everything in the divorce, he said, simply turning back to his mop. Even the good ice trays. That was 3 years ago. Rachel stared at him. The sheer audacity of the comparison sparked a tiny, irrational flare of anger in her chest. I lost $1 billion logistics firm. You lost ice trays. But the anger fizzled, replaced by a hollow ache. Loss was loss. The bottom felt the same, whether you fell from a penthouse or a split-level ranch. Thomas finished the section of the floor, wringing out the mop with a sharp squeak of the press. He parked the bucket near the wall and walked over to a battered vending machine, humming in the corner. He fed a few crumpled bills into the slot. The machine clunked and whirred, spitting out 2 paper cups. He walked back and held one out to her. Steam rose from the dark liquid inside. It tastes like battery acid, Thomas warned. But it's hot. Rachel looked at the cup. She hadn't accepted a drink from a stranger in a decade. She didn't consume anything that wasn't poured from a glass bottle or brewed by an assistant. Her hands trembled as she reached out. Her cold fingers brushed against his calloused knuckles. His hands were rough, the skin dry and cracked from chemicals. The paper cup was scalding, burning her freezing palms, but she gripped it tight. She took a sip. It was terrible. Bitter, burnt, and vaguely metallic. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. Thank you, she whispered, the warmth sliding down her throat, thawing the ice in her chest. Thomas nodded, sitting on the edge of the bench near his sleeping son. He blew on his own coffee. Floor's going to take 10 minutes to dry, he said, looking straight ahead at the tiled wall. You can stay till it does. But then I gotta lock this section down. Rachel held the terrible coffee, the cheap cardboard softening under her grip. For the first time all day, she wasn't falling. She was just sitting on a plastic bench, listening to a squeaky wheel anchored to the earth by a stranger's bitter charity. Morning did not break. It intruded. It started as a sickly grey pallor, filtering through the grime-caked windows of the transit hub, systematically washing out the hum of the fluorescent tubes. Rachel woke to the sensation of 1,000 tiny needles in her right arm and a dull, throbbing spike at the base of her skull. She shifted on the molded plastic bench, and her spine cracked in protest. Her mouth tasted like old pennies and the burnt residue of the vending machine coffee. Across the aisle, the small mound of coats stirred. A boy emerged. He looked to be about 7 with sleep-mussed brown hair and a smear of dried something ketchup dirt near the corner of his mouth. He was wearing an oversized red winter jacket that swallowed his narrow shoulders. He didn't cry or rub his eyes. He just sat up, swung his legs over the edge of the bench, and stared directly at Rachel. His gaze was unapologetic. He took in her ruined silk blouse, the mud-splattered wool coat, and the blistered, bleeding heels resting on the damp tile. "You look like a zombie," the boy said. His voice was raspy with sleep. Under normal circumstances, Rachel would have ignored the child or offered a tight, patronizing smile. Today she looked down at her hands. The manicured nails were chipped, bordered by dark crescents of city grime. Her skin was sallow. "I feel like one," she replied. Thomas appeared from a nearby utility closet. He had traded his grey coveralls for a faded denim jacket over a waffle-knit thermal. The smell of industrial pine cleaner was gone, replaced by the faint scent of stale cigarette smoke and cheap laundry detergent. He tossed a battered canvas backpack to the boy. "Let's go, Leo. Bus comes in 12 minutes. Thomas didn't look at Rachel. He was focused on securing the padlock on the closet door. It was a clear dismissal. The sanctuary of the wet floor was closed. Rachel stood. Her legs trembled, the abused muscles protesting the sudden demand to support her weight. She picked up her cardboard box. The bottom, weakened by the wet floor, hours ago, finally surrendered. It ripped open with a dull tear. The crystal paperweight hit the tile, chipping a jagged edge. The framed photo of her father slid face down across the floor. The half-empty bottle of generic aspirin clattered loudly, rolling under the bench. Rachel stared at the wreckage. Yesterday she would have snapped her fingers and someone would have cleaned it up, replaced the box and fetched her a fresh coffee. Today the only sound was the distant rumble of the early commuter trains beginning their routes. She dropped to her knees. The cold, dirty tile bit through her thin trousers. She scrambled to gather the heavy crystal and the framed photo hugging them to her chest. She ignored the aspirin. She didn't have a new box. She just had her arms. "You can't stay here," Thomas said. He was standing a few feet away holding Leo's hand. He wasn't being cruel. He was stating a municipal fact. Transit cops do a sweep at 6. They see you looking like that, they'll haul you to processing for vagrancy. The word vagrancy felt like a physical slap. She was Rachel Hayes. She was the CEO of Apex Logistics. She was on the cover of Forbes 8 months ago. "I don't..." She swallowed hard, the dryness in her throat making it difficult to speak. "I don't know where to go." Thomas looked at his watch, a cheap plastic thing with a cracked face. He sighed. It was a heavy, exhausted sound. "We're getting breakfast before I drop him at school. There's a diner 2 blocks up. You can walk behind us. But I ain't paying for you." It was the most humiliating invitation she had ever received. It was also the only lifeline she had. They walked up the concrete stairs and out into the biting December morning. The city was awake now. Delivery trucks idled loudly, pumping thick white exhaust into the freezing air. Pedestrians marched with heads down, holding steaming paper cups, ignoring the shivering woman carrying a chipped paperweight and a framed photo like a shield. The cold cut right through her damp clothes. Every step in the ruined heels sent a fresh spike of agony up her calves. She forced herself to keep her eyes on the back of Leo's red jacket, using it as a beacon in the disorienting rush of the morning commute. The diner was a narrow, grease-stained establishment, squeezed between a dry cleaner and a boarded-up storefront. The bell above the door jingled a flat metallic note as they entered. The air inside was thick and suffocatingly warm, smelling of burnt bacon, grease-scorched coffee and pine sol. Rachel slid into the cracked red vinyl booth across from Thomas and Leo. The vinyl was sticky. She set her father's photo face down on the Formica table and placed the chipped crystal beside it. A waitress with tired eyes and a stained apron dropped 3 menus on the table. She didn't look at Rachel, just pulled a pad from her pocket. "Coffee." "2," Thomas said. "And a milk for the kid." Rachel stared at the laminated menu. The plastic was sticky, smeared with someone else's syrup. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills. $84. That was her entire net worth. She looked at the prices. A plate of eggs and toast was $6. She calculated the tax. The tip. How many meals could $84 buy? How many days could she survive before she had to beg? "I'll just have the coffee," Rachel said to the waitress. Thomas looked at her over the top of his menu. He didn't argue. He just ordered pancakes for Leo and a Western omelette for himself. The food arrived quickly. The smell of the eggs and sizzling grease hit Rachel's stomach like a physical blow. Her mouth watered so violently it hurt her jaw. She gripped her hot coffee mug with both hands, trying to absorb the heat into her freezing skin, watching the boy drown his pancakes in artificial syrup. She was starving. She was broken. And the sun was fully up, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on everything she had lost. The diner was loud. Plates crashed against metal tubs behind the counter. The espresso machine hissed and spit like an angry cat. Two men in construction gear in the next booth were arguing loudly about a football game. To Rachel, the noise felt aggressive, deliberately designed to drill into her aching skull. She watched Thomas eat. He didn't savor the food. He shoveled it in with the mechanical efficiency of a man who viewed meals as fuel, not an experience. Leah was carefully dissecting a pancake, separating the syrup-soaked center from the dry edges. Rachel took a sip of her coffee. It was just as bad as the terminal vending machine, but hotter. It scalded the roof of her mouth, leaving a blister she welcomed. It was something tangible to focus on, besides the terrifying void of her immediate future. "I need to make a call," she said, her voice barely carrying over the clatter of silverware. Thomas paused his fork halfway to his mouth. He looked at her heavily. "Payphones by the bathrooms. Doesn't take cards." "I don't have coins," she said. It felt absurd saying it. She had authorized a $3 million wire transfer 24 hours ago without blinking. Now she was paralyzed by the lack of 50 cents in quarters. Thomas chewed, swallowed, and wiped his mouth with a thin paper napkin. He reached into the pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out a phone. It was an older model Android encased in a thick, scuffed rubber shell. The screen had a spiderweb crack spreading from the bottom left corner. He slid it across the sticky Formica table. "It's prepaid," he said. "Don't burn my minutes." Rachel picked it up. The device felt foreign, heavy and unrefined compared to the sleek titanium company phone that had been confiscated. She unlocked it and stared at the dial pad. "Who do you call when you fall off the map?" She dialed memory. David Vance, her lead corporate attorney, a man she paid $800 an hour to make problems disappear. The phone rang twice. A woman answered. "Vance, Sterling and Associates." "I need to speak with David," Rachel said, her voice automatically dropping into the authoritative register she used in boardrooms. "It's Rachel Hayes." There was a pause on the line. The ambient noise of a busy law office suddenly went dead quiet, as if the receptionist had covered the mouthpiece. "One moment, Ms. Hayes." Rachel waited. The seconds ticked by. She watched a drop of syrup slide slowly down the side of the plastic dispenser on her table. "Ms. Hayes," a new voice came on. It wasn't David. It was a junior partner, a man whose name she couldn't remember, someone she usually ignored in meetings. "David is unavailable. The firm is officially recusing itself from your case. A letter of disengagement was couriered to your residence this morning." The air left her lungs. "Recusing, you've had me on retainer for 5 years. You represent Apex." "We represent the corporate entity of Apex Logistics, yes," the junior partner said smoothly, the slick, frictionless tone of a legal evasion. "We do not represent you personally in matters of federal criminal fraud. Given the SEC asset freeze, there is also the matter of unpaid personal billing." "My assets are frozen. They aren't gone," Rachel snapped, panic bleeding into her anger. "I need representation for the preliminary hearing. I need David." "David cannot speak with you. I advise you to secure a public defender. Please do not call this office again." The line clicked, then the dial tone. A flat synthetic drone. Rachel lowered the phone. Her hand was shaking so badly, she almost dropped the device onto her ruined father's photo. She wiped her sweating palm on her dirty trousers and dialed again. Chloe. They had vacationed in St. Bart's 3 months ago. Rachel had paid for the jet. They had drank vintage champagne and laughed about the absurdity of their wealth. It rang 5 times, went to voicemail. Rachel didn't leave a message. She hit redial. This time, Chloe answered on the second ring. "Hello." "Chloe. It's Rach." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. In the background, Rachel could hear the faint, rhythmic thumping of an elliptical machine. Chloe was at the gym. "Rach," Chloe finally said. Her voice was strained tight. "I saw the news. My God. They froze everything, Chloe. They locked me out of the penthouse. I'm on the street. I just need a place to crash for a couple of days while I get this sorted. I just need to use your guest room." The elliptical machine stopped. "Rach, I can't. Brad is freaking out. He works in finance, you know. The optics right now. You're radioactive. He said if you come here, the feds might start looking at our accounts." "I'm not radioactive, I'm your friend," Rachel whispered, the fight draining out of her. "I paid for your kitchen remodel, Chloe." It was a low blow, and she knew it. But desperation strips away manners. "That was a gift," Chloe said sharply, her tone instantly defensive. "And frankly, I have no idea where that money came from. Now do I look? I'm sorry. I really am. But you can't come here. Good luck, Rachel." Click. Rachel sat perfectly still. The diner spun around her in a blur of grease, neon, and noise. She placed the cracked phone back on the table, sliding it toward Thomas. She had built a life out of ledgers and leverage. She had surrounded herself with people who only loved the gravity she generated. Now the gravity was gone, and she was just floating in a cold, empty vacuum. Thomas didn't ask how the calls went. He didn't need to. He recognized the look on her face. He had worn it himself. He reached over and pulled his plate toward the center of the table. He used his fork to cut a generous corner off his Western omelette. He slid the piece of egg onto a small, clean saucer and pushed it across the sticky table toward Rachel. "You can't panic on an empty stomach," he said flatly. "It burns too fast. Eat the eggs." Rachel looked at the yellow square of egg dotted with green peppers and cheap ham. It was the least elegant food she had ever been served. Her hands trembled as she picked up her fork. She brought the food to her mouth. The egg was rubbery, heavily salted, and dripping with grease. She closed her eyes. A hot, humiliating tear leaked out, cutting a clean track through the dirt on her cheek. She chewed the terrible egg swallowed and picked up her fork to take another bite. Chewing that rubbery, over-salted square of egg was the hardest physical task Rachel had performed in a decade. It tasted like burnt butter and desperation. She forced her throat to swallow, feeling the heavy lump slide down into her hollow stomach. The salt stung the microscopic cracks in her lips. She didn't look up at Thomas. She couldn't. If she met his eyes, the fragile dam holding back a total psychological collapse would shatter right here in booth 4 of a grease-trap diner. She took another bite, then another. She ate with the mechanical urgency of a stray dog. When the plate was entirely clean, Thomas slid a handful of crumpled bills and a tower of dull quarters onto the table. He stacked the coins with his calloused thumbs, ensuring the tip was exactly 15%. Rachel watched the silver discs click together. Yesterday she wouldn't have bent down to pick a quarter off the sidewalk. Today, she tracked the geometry of that small stack with desperate fascination, realizing it represented the exact margin between eating and starving. "Time to move, Leo," Thomas said, scraping his chair back. The metal legs shrieked against the linoleum. The blast of winter air that greeted them outside the diner was violently cold. The sun was up, but it offered no warmth, just a sterile, blinding glare bouncing off the wet concrete. Rachel's wool coat, still damp from the overnight rain, instantly stiffened. The chill sank straight through her skin, wrapping icy fingers around her ribs. She fell into step behind them, her ruined heels clicking a pathetic, uneven rhythm on the pavement. Every step sent a fresh jolt of white-hot pain up her calves, as the blisters on her heels rubbed raw against the wet leather. She focused her eyes on the fraying seams of Leo's oversized red jacket. The left shoulder had a small patch held together by safety pins. It was a logistical failure, a breakdown in supply chain. Her mind, desperate to retreat to familiar corporate patterns, tried to calculate the cost of a new zipper versus the labor of pinning it. They walked for 6 blocks. The towering glass monoliths of the financial district faded, replaced by squat brick facades and narrow storefronts with heavily barred windows. The smell of exhaust grew thicker here, mixed with the sharp, acidic tang of garbage waiting on the curbs. The elementary school was a fortress of faded beige brick, surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. The asphalt playground was swarming with kids wrapped in neon scarves and oversized hats, their shrieks piercing the cold morning air. Thomas stopped at the gate. He didn't hug his son. He knelt down, putting himself at eye level with the boy. He adjusted the collar of Leo's coat, pulling it tighter against the wind, his rough hands moving with surprising gentleness. "Stay out of the back stairwell, understand?" Thomas said, his voice dropping into a low, serious register. "And eat the apple I packed, not just the crackers." Leo nodded, his small face serious. He looked over his father's shoulder, his brown eyes locking on to Rachel. She was hovering 3 feet away, shivering violently, clutching her chipped crystal paperweight and the framed photo to her chest like makeshift armor. "Is the zombie lady coming home with us?" Leo asked. His voice carried over the din of the playground. Rachel flinched. The blunt honesty of children was something she usually avoided by employing a phalanx of nannies for her executives. Thomas didn't look back at her. "No," he said flatly. "She's just walking our way." He stood up, giving Leo a brief, solid pat on the shoulder. "Go on. Be smart today." Leo turned and vanished into the sea of bobbing winter hats. Thomas stood at the fence for a long moment, watching until the red jacket disappeared through the heavy metal double doors. Then he turned to face Rachel. The wind whipped her damp hair across her face. Her teeth were chattering a rapid, uncontrollable clicking sound that she couldn't stop. Her lips had taken on a faint, bluish tint. "Transit cops are sweeping the subways by now," Thomas said. He jammed his hands into the deep pockets of his denim jacket. He looked exhausted. The deep creases around his mouth were carved in shadow. "Libraries don't open until 10. You can't sit in a park looking like that. You'll freeze to death in an hour." Rachel started, but her jaw seized with a violent shiver. "I'll figure it out. I just need to reach someone. A colleague." "You already tried that," Thomas pointed out, devoid of malice but dripping with reality. "Your people are gone. That's how it works. The money leaves, the ghosts scatter." He stared at her bleeding feet. Then he looked at the heavy, useless objects she was clutching. "I work the night shift at the terminal," Thomas said slowly, as if arguing with himself and losing. "I sleep during the day. My apartment is quiet. It's also cramped, smells like old pipes, and the heat barely works. But it's indoors." It wasn't an invitation. It was an emergency protocol. Rachel wanted to say no. She wanted to summon her pride flag down a cab and bark an address to a luxury hotel where she had status. But the cabs whipping past them were just yellow blurs, and her pockets were entirely empty. The sheer, terrifying weight of her vulnerability crushed her pride into dust. "Okay," she whispered. The word tasted like ash. The bus ride to Thomas's neighborhood took 40 minutes. Rachel sat rigidly on the cracked plastic seat, pressed against a window smeared with condensation and grime. The bus smelled powerfully of wet dog-stale sweat and the sharp bite of cheap floor wax. Every time the vehicle hit a pothole, the shock wave traveled straight up her spine. Thomas sat 2 rows ahead of her, his head leaning against the vibrating glass, his eyes closed. He wasn't keeping watch over her. He had offered the shelter, but he wasn't offering salvation. They stepped off the bus into a neighborhood that felt forgotten by the city skyline. The sidewalks were buckled, pushing up weeds that had frozen into brittle black stalks. Row houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their paint peeling in long, curling strips like dead skin. Thomas stopped in front of a narrow building, sandwiched between a closed laundromat and a bodega with a flickering neon sign. He pulled a ring of brass keys from his pocket. The heavy front door was severely scarred. The wood around the deadbolt splintered from old break-ins. 5 flights, Thomas said without looking back. No elevator. Rachel stared at the steep, narrow staircase. The linoleum runner was a faded, sickly green, worn through to the wood in the center of each step. The air inside the stairwell was thick, smelling of boiled cabbage, damp wool and cigarette smoke. She gripped the wobbly handrail. The first step was agony. The blister on her right heel finally ruptured the skin, tearing away to leave a raw, weeping circle. She gasped a sharp hiss of pain that echoed in the tight space. Thomas paused on the landing above. He looked down at her. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer words of encouragement. He just waited, silent and immovable, until she forced her other foot upward. It took her 7 minutes to climb the 5 floors. By the time she reached the top landing, she was sweating despite the chill, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She left tiny rust-colored smears of blood on the edge of the final 3 steps. Thomas shoved his shoulder hard against the door of Unit 5B as he turned the key. It popped open with a loud crack. He stepped inside. Rachel followed, crossing the threshold into a reality she had previously only seen on muted news segments in the back of town cars. It was a single room that functioned as a kitchen living area and hallway. A narrow doorway led to what she assumed was a bedroom and another to a bathroom. The walls were painted a dull landlord special, off-white, severely scuffed near the baseboards. A rusted radiator under the single-barred window hissed violently, spitting a few drops of water onto the warped laminate flooring. It smelled intensely of old cooking grease and cheap laundry detergent. Yet beneath the poverty there was a rigid, desperate order. A worn corduroy sofa was brushed clean. A small square dining table was wiped spotless, 2 wooden chairs pushed perfectly flush against it. In the corner, a milk crate held a stack of children's books, lined up by height. It was the architecture of a man holding on to his dignity, with a white-knuckled grip. "Take your shoes off," Thomas said, unzipping his denim jacket and hanging it on a hook by the door. "You're bleeding on the floor." Rachel looked down. Her custom Italian stilettos were ruined, coated in grey mud and dark blood. She bent down her fingers, trembling, and managed to undo the delicate ankle straps. She slid her feet out. The cold laminate felt shocking against her raw, blistering skin. She placed her father's photo and the chipped crystal paperweight on the small dining table. They looked absurd here. Symbols of immense wealth dropped into a vacuum of survival. Thomas walked into the small kitchen area, a space no wider than a closet. He turned on the faucet. The pipes groaned a deep rattling sound in the walls before spitting out a stream of cloudy water. He filled a battered aluminum kettle and set it on the gas stove, clicking the burner until a ring of blue flame erupted. He walked over to a small dresser near the sofa, pulled open a drawer and threw a bundle of fabric at her. Rachel caught it instinctively. It was a pair of faded grey sweatpants, the drawstring missing, and a plain, worn black t-shirt. "Bathroom's through there." He gestured to the narrow door. "Change. Your clothes are soaked, and I can't afford to keep the heat cranked to dry you out." Rachel held the cheap cotton. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand a bathrobe, a hot shower, a glass of Sancerre. Instead, She limped toward the bathroom, closing the flimsy, hollow-core door behind her. The bathroom was the size of an airplane lavatory. The fluorescent bulb overhead buzzed like a trapped wasp, flickering erratically. Rachel looked into the medicine cabinet mirror. The silver backing was flaking off the edges, distorting the reflection. She stared at the woman in the glass. Her $400 blowout was a tangled, damp rat's nest plastered to her skull. The expensive foundation had oxidized, leaving her skin looking sallow and dead. Her mascara had run, creating deep, bruised hollows under her eyes. The silk blouse clung to her shivering frame, stained with rain and diner grease. She stripped off the silk and the wool, leaving them in a wet, expensive pile on the cracked tile floor. She pulled on Thomas's clothes. The sweatpants swallowed her to dragging on the floor. The t-shirt smelled faintly of his pine-scented soap. When she stepped back out into the main room, the kettle was screaming. Thomas poured the boiling water into 2 mismatched mugs. He set one on the table next to her father's picture. He dropped a generic tea bag into it. "I sleep until 4, he said, taking his mug and walking toward the bedroom door. He didn't look at her in the oversized clothes. "Don't answer the door. Don't touch the thermostat. If you leave, pull the door shut hard so the lock catches. You can't come back in. Thomas," she said, her voice cracked. "When my accounts unfreeze, I will compensate you for this. Generously, I promise." He stopped in the doorway. He turned his head slowly. The look in his eyes wasn't angry. It was something worse. It was pity. "Don't try to buy me with ghost money, Rachel," he said softly. "Down here we only deal in what's real. Drink your tea." He closed the bedroom door. The latch clicked loudly. Rachel stood alone in the cramped, hissing apartment, wearing a stranger's clothes, finally understanding the sheer, terrifying weight of having absolutely nothing. Time mutates when you are stripped of your schedule. Without back-to-back meetings, conference calls, or a digital calendar vibrating against her wrist every 15 minutes, the hours in Thomas's apartment didn't pass. They pooled around her, stagnant and heavy. Rachel sat at the small formica table, staring at the chipped mug. The tea had gone cold hours ago, leaving a dark, bitter ring against the ceramic. The radiator under the window kept up its rhythmic, violent hissing, occasionally spitting a drop of rusty water onto the warped floorboards. That sound was the only proof the world was still turning. Her right hand kept twitching, automatically reaching toward her hip. Phantom limb syndrome. Her brain was firing the neural pathways to check her titanium smartphone, expecting a flood of emails, a text from her broker, a headline about Apex Logistics. Every time her fingers brushed the cheap, rough cotton of Thomas's oversized sweatpants instead of cold metal, a fresh wave of nausea washed over her. She was entirely disconnected. Erased. She stood up. Her feet screamed in protest. The raw blisters on her heels throbbed with a hot, localized pulse that synced perfectly with her heartbeat. She ignored the pain dragging her feet across the laminate floor to the small kitchen counter. She wasn't trying to snoop, but in a space this small, a man's entire life was laid bare on a 2-foot stretch of counter space. A stack of mail sat next to the sink. The envelopes were cheap, thin paper, the windows revealing bold red lettering. Past due. Final notice. Rachel leaned closer, reading the top invoice upside down. It was a gas bill. The total was $42.50. $42. Yesterday she had tipped a valet $50 just to keep her car out front while she grabbed a matcha latte. She stared at the red ink, feeling a profound, nauseating disconnect. She used to move hundreds of millions of dollars with a digital signature. She understood complex offshore tax shelters and the abstract architecture of high-frequency trading. But looking at this piece of cheap paper, she realized she knew absolutely nothing about actual money. Her money was theoretical. Ghost money, Thomas had called it. This $42 was intensely real. It was the difference between a warm room and freezing in the dark. It carried more weight than her entire phantom portfolio. Needing a distraction from the suffocating silence, she walked back to the bathroom. Her ruined clothes lay in a sodden, filthy pile on the floor. The silk blouse was smeared with grease from the diner and grey grime from the subway tile. She turned on the tiny sink. The plumbing groaned, spitting a chaotic stream of lukewarm water. She picked up a bar of bright green, institutional-looking soap resting on the edge of the basin. It smelled sharply of artificial pine and lye. Rachel submerged the silk blouse in the sink and began to rub the soap against the stains. Her hands, soft and manicured, felt clumsy. She scrubbed harder, the rough soap catching on the delicate threads. The water in the basin quickly turned a murky, foul grey. She scrubbed until her knuckles ached. When she finally pulled the fabric from the water, the grease stain was gone, but so was the integrity of the garment. The harsh chemicals in the cheap soap had eaten through the delicate silk, leaving a massive, frayed hole right near the collar. She stared at the ruined fabric water dripping from the torn edges, splashing onto her bare, blistered feet. It was just a shirt. It was a $2,000 shirt, but it was just fabric. Yet staring at that hole, the dam finally broke. Rachel sank to her knees on the cold, cracked bathroom tile. She dropped the wet silk into the sink and pressed her face into her hands. She didn't cry beautifully. There were no single cinematic tears rolling down her cheeks. It was an ugly, guttural breakdown. Her chest heaved violently, pulling in ragged, wet gasps of air that smelled of pine soap and mildew. Snot ran down her upper lip. Her shoulders shook so hard they hit the edge of the porcelain pedestal sink. She wept for the mahogany table she would never sit at again. She wept for the titanium phone. She wept for the realization that her friends were merely parasites attached to her net worth. And she wept because her feet were bleeding. She was wearing a stranger's clothes, and she couldn't even wash a damn shirt without destroying it. She cried until her tear ducts ran completely dry, leaving her eyes burning and swollen her throat raw. When the shaking finally subsided, she remained on the floor for a long time, listening to the drip of the faucet. The panic had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell of exhaustion. The arrogance that had fueled her entire adult life had been meticulously peeled away in less than 24 hours, leaving her entirely raw. She pushed herself up, using the sink for leverage. She looked in the flaking mirror. The woman looking back was unrecognizable. Her hair was a matted, wild mess. Her eyes were bloodshot, framed by puffy red skin. The ghost of Rachel Hayes was dead. Whoever was left had to figure out how to survive the afternoon. Late afternoon did not bring sunlight to the apartment. It simply thickened the grey shadows creeping out from the corners of the room. The heavy lock on the front door clattered loudly. Rachel, dozing fitfully on the stiff corduroy sofa, jerked awake. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a residual jolt of corporate paranoia, expecting federal agents or process servers. The door swung open, and Thomas stepped inside, a blast of freezing hallway air following him. He looked exactly as he had hours ago, exhausted, guarded, and completely drained of color. "I have to get Leo," he said, not bothering to take off his coat. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't look at her swollen red eyes. He just grabbed a set of keys from a hook by the door. "Don't touch the stove." He was gone before she could answer, the door clicking firmly shut. 30 minutes later, the lock rattled again. This time, the silence of the apartment was instantly shattered. Leo burst through the door, a tiny hurricane of red nylon and chaotic energy. He dropped a battered backpack onto the floor with a heavy thud, kicked off his muddy sneakers without undoing the laces, and tossed his wet mittens onto the radiator. They immediately began to sizzle, filling the room with the smell of damp wool. Thomas followed him in, locking the door and shooting a tired glance at the mittens. "Shoes by the mat, Leo. How many times?" Leo ignored him, his brown eyes locking onto Rachel. She was sitting rigidly on the edge of the sofa, her knees pulled tight together in the oversized sweatpants. "You're still here," Leo said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "Yes," Rachel said. Her voice felt rusty. "I am." Leo marched over to the sofa, stopping a foot away from her knees. He tilted his head, studying her with the terrifying, unblinking scrutiny only a 7-year-old can weaponize. "Dad says you don't have any money, not even for a bus ticket." "Leo," Thomas warned sharply from the kitchen, unzipping his jacket. "It's true," Rachel said, looking directly at the boy. There was no point in employing PR spin here. "I have exactly $0. My friend Matteo's dad has $0, but he has a car he sleeps in," Leo offered practically. "Do you have a car?" "No." Leo seemed to process this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slightly crushed, lint-covered piece of hard candy wrapped in shiny green plastic. He held it out to her. "You can have this. It's sour apple." "I don't like sour apple." Rachel stared at the small, sticky offering resting on the boy's slightly grimy palm. A profound, aching lump formed in her throat. She slowly reached out her trembling fingers, pinching the plastic wrapper. "Thank you, Leo," she whispered. "Don't eat it before dinner," Thomas called out. He was standing at the tiny stove, filling an aluminum pot with water from the tap. "I'm making macaroni." Rachel slipped the candy into her pocket. She stood up her blistered feet, screaming in protest, and hobbled toward the kitchen area. "Let me help." Thomas looked over his shoulder, his eyebrows slightly raised. "Help?" "Yes, I can cook." It was a lie. She had a private chef who prepared macrobiotic meals, and before that, she lived off high-end sushi delivery. But the sheer need to be useful to justify the oxygen she was consuming in this tiny space overrode her common sense. Thomas didn't argue. He pulled a package of generic hot dogs from the small refrigerator and tossed them onto a plastic cutting board on the counter. He handed her a paring knife. The handle was cracked plastic. The blade was dull and spotted with rust. "Slice them thin," he instructed, turning back to the stove to rip open a cardboard box of macaroni. Rachel stood over the cutting board. She picked up the cold, slippery meat. She gripped the knife awkwardly. She pressed the blade down. It didn't cut. It just mashed the meat into an ugly, deformed curve. She applied more pressure. Her hands still weakened by the adrenaline crash, and the cold began to shake. The slippery casing of the hot dog rolled under her fingers. The dull knife slipped. It didn't cut her, but the sudden, violent loss of friction sent her hand jerking forward. The knife clattered loudly onto the laminate floor, skidding under the stove. Rachel gasped instinctively, stepping back, her shoulders bracing for the inevitable explosion. In her world, a mistake like that resulted in a screaming match. When her assistant had dropped a tablet during a quarterly review, Rachel had thrown a ceramic coffee mug against the wall. She closed her eyes, waiting for Thomas to yell, to tell her she was useless, to throw her out into the freezing street. Silence. She opened her eyes. Thomas was kneeling on the floor. He reached under the stove, retrieved the knife, and stood up. He walked to the sink, ran the blade under the hot water, and wiped it on his jeans. He didn't hand it back to her. "Go sit down, Rachel," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even annoyed. It was just impossibly heavy. "I'm sorry," she stammered, her cheeks burning with a hot, shameful flush. The knife slipped. I can do it." "I know it slipped," Thomas said, taking the cutting board and easily slicing the meat into perfectly uniform rounds. but we only have 1 pack of meat, and I don't have a first aid kit if you cut your finger off. Sit down." Rachel backed away, retreating to the small dining table. She sat in the hard wooden chair, watching him work. He moved with a practiced, brutal efficiency, pouring the pasta into the boiling water, ripping open the foil packet of violently orange cheese powder, stirring the sliced hot dogs into the steaming mass. He wasn't angry at her failure, because he hadn't expected her to succeed. He understood what she was only just realizing: her entire skill set was entirely useless here. She could negotiate a corporate merger in 3 languages, but she couldn't feed a child. She was utterly, profoundly incompetent in the real world. Thomas set a steaming bowl of bright orange pasta in front of her. The smell of artificial cheese and salty meat hit her nose. It was the least refined meal she had ever seen. She picked up a cheap, bent aluminum fork. She took a bite. It was scalding hot, incredibly salty, and coated her mouth in a thick, starchy paste. She closed her eyes and ate, swallowing her pride, with every heavy, unglamorous bite anchored to the table by the undeniable reality of a 7-year-old sour apple candy sitting in her pocket. The aftermath of dinner was marked by a heavy, suffocating lethargy. Thomas didn't say a word as he scraped the remains of the macaroni into a small plastic container. His movements, usually precise and efficient, were sluggish. The deep purple bruising under his eyes looked darker in the harsh light of the bare kitchen bulb. He was a man running on fumes, his engine sputtering dangerously close to seizing up entirely. He left the dirty pot and the bowls in the tiny stained sink. "I need an hour," he muttered to the room at large, rubbing his face with calloused palms. "My shift starts at 11. Leo, finish your worksheet. Don't turn the TV on." He walked into the bedroom and shut the door. Less than a minute later, Rachel heard the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a man who had entirely succumbed to exhaustion. The apartment fell silent, save for the persistent hiss of the radiator and the scratching of a pencil against paper. Leo was sitting cross-legged on the faded rug, hunched over a crumpled piece of paper on the coffee table. He was chewing aggressively on the eraser of his pencil, a frown pulling at his small face. Rachel sat at the dining table for a long time. She looked at the pile of dirty dishes in the sink. The bright orange cheese paste was already congealing on the aluminum pot, hardening into a stubborn crust. In her old life, a mess was simply an instruction to be delegated. Now the mess was just a fact, and facts did not disappear just because you ignored them. She stood up. Her calves burned, the muscles seizing from the unaccustomed trauma of the day's walk. She limped to the kitchen counter. She picked up the sponge resting on the edge of the sink. It felt slimy, smelling faintly of sour mildew. It was disgusting. She turned on the hot water. It came out in a sputtering, aggressive blast, splashing her borrowed black t-shirt. Rachel flinched, biting back a curse. She squirted a blue drop of cheap dish soap onto the sponge and began to scrub the pot. The crust was stubborn. It required force. Her shoulders, tight with lingering adrenaline and stress, ached as she dug the rough side of the sponge into the aluminum. The hot water turned her manicured hands a raw, blotchy red. The soap dried out her knuckles instantly. It was tedious, unglamorous labor. But as she watched the orange sludge wash down the drain, replaced by the dull shine of cheap metal, a strange microscopic knot in her chest loosened. She had produced a result. It wasn't a corporate acquisition, and it wasn't a surging stock price. It was just a clean pot. But she had done it herself. She had impacted her immediate environment with her own hands. She rinsed the last bowl, set it on a threadbare towel, and dried her hands on her sweatpants. 7 + 4 is a stupid question, Leo announced loudly to the empty room. Rachel turned. The boy was glaring at his paper, the pencil lead snapped off a grey smudge, ruining the cheap worksheet. She walked over and sat on the edge of the corduroy sofa, keeping a respectful distance. Is it Yes, Leo grumbled. It's 11. But then it asks what happens if you take away 5. Why did they add 4 just to take 5 away? It's inefficient. Rachel blinked. The word inefficient, coming out of a 7-year-old in an oversized hand-me-down t-shirt, was jarring. It was a word she used to weaponize in boardrooms to gut entire departments. They aren't just numbers, Leo, Rachel said softly. Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, felt tentative in the small room. Think of them as inventory. Leo looked up, his brow furrowed. What's inventory? Stuff you have, she adjusted quickly. Apples, or hot dogs. You have 7 hot dogs. The supplier, the store, gives you 4 more. How many do you have? 11. Right. But then a customer comes in. He's hungry. He wants to buy 5 hot dogs. If you sell them, how many hot dogs are left in your store? Leo stared at the paper. His lips moved slightly. 6. Exactly. It's not inefficient. It's a transaction. You're tracking what comes in and what goes out. If you don't know the math, you don't know what your store is worth. Leo didn't smile, but the frustration melted off his face. He grabbed a fresh pencil from his backpack and wrote a heavy, dark 6 on the paper. He moved to the next problem without complaining. Rachel sat there watching the top of his brown head. She used to explain multi-million-dollar tax deficits to panicking board members. Now she was explaining subtraction with theoretical hot dogs. But the core logic remained. The structure of the world, the hard math of reality, was still there. She just had to learn how to read the smaller numbers. The bedroom door clicked open. Thomas stepped out. His hair was sticking up on one side. He looked at the kitchen. He saw the empty sink, the clean pot drying on the towel. Then he looked at the sofa, seeing Rachel sitting quietly next to his son, watching him finish his worksheet. He didn't say thank you. Words like that were a luxury currency he didn't deal in. But the tight defensive set of his shoulders dropped just a fraction of an inch. He walked to the door, pulling his heavy work boots on over his thick socks. He grabbed his denim jacket and the ring of brass keys. "Lock the deadbolt behind me." Thomas set his hand on the brass knob. He paused, looking back at her. The harsh overhead light caught the deep lines on his face. "There's bread in the fridge, peanut butter on the top shelf. If he gets hungry tomorrow morning, make him a sandwich before school. Spread it thick." Rachel stood up. Her feet throbbed, but her spine was straighter. It wasn't an invitation to stay forever. It was an instruction for tomorrow morning. It was a job. "I can do that," she said. Thomas nodded once, a brief, sharp movement. He stepped out into the freezing hallway, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. Rachel walked over and slid the deadbolt into place. It fell with a heavy, satisfying thud. She was entirely locked out of her old life. The penthouse, the bank accounts, the empire, they were gone, vaporized by a federal freeze. But standing in the cramped-smelling hallway of a 5th-floor walk-up, she felt the sour apple candy heavy in her pocket, and she realized something profound. She hadn't lost everything. She had just lost the things she didn't actually need to survive. That concludes the dramatic story of Rachel's catastrophic fall and her raw, gritty introduction to real life. The journey from a billionaire's boardroom to a cramped, working-class apartment proves that rock bottom isn't a burial ground, it's a foundation. If this grounded human story resonated with you, please hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with a friend who might need a reminder about what truly matters when the chips are down. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dive storytelling. Drop a comment below. What's the one small everyday task that keeps you grounded during tough times?